Welcome to Alien Whispers. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Now, let's dive into the story. The docking bay of the Nexus-7 space station was a chaotic symphony of clanging metal and humming gravity loaders. But Jaxon Reed had never been one to shy away from the grind. That is, until a crate of plasma conduits slipped its moorings, pinning him beneath a pile of debris. Pain had seared through his side, stars bursting in his vision, and the last thing he remembered was the bitter taste of regret before darkness claimed him. Soft lights flickered against his eyelids, pulling him back to consciousness. A low, steady hum filled the air, accompanied by the faint scent of antiseptic. Jaxon groaned, trying to shift, but a sharp twinge at his ribs made him rethink that plan. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the sterile glow of the Med Bay, where sleek monitors lined the walls and a faint blue hologram pulsed with data above his bed. "Easy there, spacer," a voice purred, smooth as velvet and laced with a teasing lilt. "You're not going anywhere just yet." Jackson's gaze snapped to the source, and his breath caught. Hovering over him was a vision that could have been plucked from a dream. She had shimmering blue skin, adorned with intricate patterns that seemed to glow faintly, like stars scattered across a midnight sky. Her long, dark hair cascaded over one shoulder, framing a face that was both delicate and commanding, with deep emerald eyes that sparkled with mischief. Her uniform, a sleek silver affair with blue accents, clung to her curves in a way that was both professional and undeniably captivating. A small, tilted cap perched on her head, more charming than official, completing the look of a futuristic medic who knew exactly the effect she had. "Name's Lyra Voss," she said, her smile revealing a hint of sharp canines that only added to her allure. "I'm your personal healer." And you, Jaxon Reed, took quite a hit. He tried to summon his usual grin, but another stab of pain made him wince. "If this is what recovery looks like, maybe I should get injured more often." Lyra's laugh was a melody, light and musical, filling the sterile room with warmth. "Don't get any ideas, human," she teased, her eyes flicking over him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. She tapped a sleek tablet, her fingers moving with practiced grace. "Broken rib and a mild concussion. Nothing I can't fix, but you'll need to behave." "Behave?" Jaxon arched a brow, ignoring the ache in his side. "Not sure that's in my skill set." Her smile widened, and she leaned in just a fraction, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Then I'll have to keep a close eye on you." The air between them seemed to hum, charged with an unspoken promise. She moved to adjust the monitor beside his bed, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. The touch was fleeting, professional, but it sent a spark through him, like a current he couldn't ignore. Lyra's eyes met his for a moment, and he could have sworn her glowing patterns pulsed brighter, betraying a hint of interest. The sliding door to the Med Bay whooshed open, shattering the moment. Two of Jackson's crewmates, Marco and Tara, poked their heads in, their grins wide and knowing. "Well, look at you, Reed," Marco hooted, laid up with the prettiest doc in the quadrant. Tara elbowed him, laughing. "Don't die on us, Jaxon. We need you to keep breaking stuff so we look good." Lyra turned, hands on her hips, her expression a mix of amusement and authority. "Out, both of you," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "My patient needs rest, not your nonsense." Marco raised his hands in mock surrender. "Yes, ma'am. Don't let him sweet-talk you, document." As the door slid shut, Lyra shook her head, her lips twitching with a smile. "Your friends are trouble. They're jealous," Jaxon said, his voice low, testing the waters. "Can't blame him." Lyra paused, her emerald eyes locking onto his. For a heartbeat, the room felt smaller, the hum of the monitors fading into the background. She stepped closer, adjusting the pillow behind his head with deliberate care, her fingers grazing his shoulder. The touch lingered just a moment too long, and Jackson's pulse quickened, his mind racing with possibilities. "You're trouble too," she murmured, her voice soft but laced with a challenge. "But I'm very good at handling trouble." As she straightened, Her glowing patterns seemed to dance under the lights, and Jaxon knew one thing for sure. His recovery was about to get a lot more interesting. The days in the Nexus-7 Med Bay blurred into a rhythm of soft beeps and sterile light. But for Jaxon Reed, each moment carried a new kind of electricity. His broken rib ached less with every passing hour, thanks to the high-tech bone mender humming at his bedside. But it was Lyra Voss who truly made the sterile room feel alive. Her presence was a pulse, a warmth that lingered long after she stepped away, and Jaxon found himself counting the minutes until her next visit. Lyra's checks were a daily ritual, each one a delicate dance of professionalism and something more. She'd glide into the room, her silver uniform catching the light, the glowing patterns on her blue skin shimmering like a starfield. "Let's see how you're holding up, spacer," she'd say, her voice a teasing melody as she pulled up a chart on her tablet. Her fingers, deft and sure, would brush his wrist to check his pulse, the contact sending a quiet jolt through him. The touch was always light, clinical in intent, but it lingered just a heartbeat longer than necessary, her emerald eyes flicking up to meet his with a knowing glint. "Pulse is steady," she'd murmur, her lips twitching into a smile. "But it's a little fast today. Nervous about something?" Jaxon leaned back against the pillows, his grin lazy but deliberate. "Only about you sneaking up on me like that, Doc. Gotta give a guy some warning." Her laugh, bright and musical, filled the room, and she'd lean closer, adjusting the bandage across his ribs with careful precision. Her fingers grazed the edge of his skin, warm through the thin fabric of his medical tunic, and Jaxon couldn't help but notice the way her glowing patterns pulsed brighter, as if betraying a secret. "You're healing nicely," she said, her voice softer now, almost intimate. "But I need to make sure you're not pushing yourself too hard." "Pushing myself?" He arched a brow, his tone playful. "I'm just lying here, letting you work your magic." Lyra's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Magic takes time, human, and patience." Her hand rested on his shoulder for a moment, steadying him as she adjusted the pillow behind his head, and the air between them seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken pull. Their conversations grew longer, weaving through the hours like threads of a tapestry. Jaxon told her about his life on the station, grueling shifts in the docking bay, the camaraderie of his crew, the quiet moments staring out at the stars, wondering what else was out there. Lyra listened, her head tilted, her gaze soft but piercing, as if she could see straight through him. In return, she shared glimpses of her own world, a childhood on a distant planet where the skies burned violet, her training as a healer, the pull of adventure that brought her to Nexus-7. Her stories were vivid, painted with a warmth that made Jaxon feel closer to her, like they were building something fragile but real. "You ever miss it?" he asked one afternoon, his voice low as she checked the bone mender settings. "Your homeworld, I mean." Lyra paused, her fingers stilling on the device. "Sometimes," she admitted, her eyes distant. "But then I meet someone interesting, and I think maybe this place has its own kind of magic." Her gaze flicked to his, and the weight of her words settled over them, heavy with possibility. The tension between them grew with each visit, a slow-burning fire stoked by glances and fleeting touches. Jaxon noticed the way Lyra's movements slowed when she was near him, the way her breath caught when their hands brushed. He caught himself watching her, memorizing the curve of her smile, the way her hair fell like a dark waterfall over her shoulder. The Med Bay, once cold and clinical, felt like a sanctuary, a space where the rest of the universe faded away. One evening, as the station's artificial lights dimmed to mimic night, Lyra lingered longer than usual. The monitors cast a soft glow across the room, bathing her in a halo of blue. She sat on the edge of Jaxon's bed, her tablet forgotten on the counter, her hands folded in her lap. "You're almost clear to go back to work," she said, but her voice carried a hint of reluctance, as if she wasn't ready to let him go. "Almost." Jaxon tilted his head, his grin teasing. "You sure you're not just keeping me here for the company?" Lyra's laugh was softer this time, almost shy. "Maybe I am," she said, her eyes locking onto his. The air stilled, the hum of the station fading into a distant murmur. Her glowing patterns pulsed faintly, and Jaxon felt his pulse quicken, matching the rhythm of her light. He reached out, his hand brushing hers, a tentative gesture that felt like crossing a threshold. Her fingers curled slightly, not pulling away, and the warmth of her skin sent a shiver through him. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the space between them alive with unspoken words. Lyra's lips parted, as if she might speak, but instead, she leaned closer, her breath warm against his cheek. "You're dangerous, Jaxon Reed," she whispered, her voice a mix of challenge and surrender. Her eyes held his, deep and endless, and Jaxon felt the world narrow to just the two of them, a moment suspended in time, heavy with anticipation. The door remained closed, the station quiet beyond the walls, and Jaxon knew this was only the beginning of something neither of them could ignore. The Nexus-7 Med Bay had become Jaxon Reed's universe, a cocoon of soft lights and quiet hums where time seemed to bend around Lyra Voss. Each day brought her closer, her presence a steady pull that made his heart race faster than any docking bay mishap ever could. Their conversations had woven a fragile bridge between them, and the lingering touches, her fingers brushing his wrist, her hand steadying his shoulder, had stoked a fire that neither could ignore. Tonight, though, the air felt different, heavier, as if the station itself held its breath. Lyra entered the room later than usual, the station's artificial night casting long shadows across the sterile floor. The monitors glowed faintly, their blue light dancing across her shimmering skin, the intricate patterns pulsing like a heartbeat. Her silver uniform seemed to hug her form a little tighter, or perhaps it was Jaxon's imagination, sharpened by days of watching her every move. She carried no tablet, no medical tools, just a quiet intensity that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. "You're late, Doc," Jaxon said, his voice low, teasing, though his pulse betrayed his calm. He leaned back against the pillows, his grin a challenge. "Thought you'd forgotten about me." Lyra's lips curved into a smile, soft but laced with mischief. "Forget you?" she murmured, her emerald eyes locking onto his. "Not a chance, spacer." She stepped closer, her movements slow, deliberate, like a star drifting into orbit. The air between them thrummed, charged with a current that had been building for days. She paused at the edge of his bed, her gaze searching his face as if memorizing every detail. "You're healing faster than I expected," she said, her voice softer now, almost hesitant. "Soon, you won't need me here." Jaxon's grin faded, replaced by something raw, unguarded. "Who says I want to get out of here?" He reached out, his hand grazing hers, the warmth of her skin sending a shiver through him. Her fingers didn't pull away, instead curling slightly, as if anchoring them together. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken truths, and Jaxon felt his breath catch, the world narrowing to just her. Lyra leaned closer, her hair falling like a dark curtain, brushing against his cheek. Her breath was warm, a whisper of sweetness that made his heart stumble. "Your trouble, Jaxon Reed," she whispered, her voice a velvet caress, equal parts challenge and surrender. Her eyes held his, deep and endless, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to pause, the hum of the station fading into silence. Then, slowly, as if drawn by an invisible thread, she closed the distance. Her lips brushed his, soft and tentative, a fleeting touch that sent a wave of warmth through him. The kiss was gentle at first, a question unspoken, but as Jaxon leaned into her, it deepened, a quiet hunger stirring between them. Her lips were soft, warm, a perfect fit against his, and time seemed to cease, the universe shrinking to the point where they met. His hand found her cheek, his fingers tracing the glowing patterns of her skin, each pulse a silent confession of her own racing heart. The kiss grew bolder, a dance of breath and warmth, each moment more consuming than the last. Jaxon felt a fire ignite within him, not just desire but something deeper, a connection that made the sterile Med Bay feel like home. Lyra's breath hitched, a soft sound that sent a thrill through him, and her hand rested lightly on his chest, steadying herself as if the kiss had shaken her as much as it had him. When they finally parted, the air was thick with their shared breath, their foreheads touching as they lingered in the afterglow. Lyra's eyes were heavy-lidded, her glowing patterns brighter than ever, betraying the flush of her emotions. "That," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of amusement and wonder, "was not in the medical protocol." Jaxon chuckled, the sound low and rough, his thumb brushing her cheek. "Good thing I'm a terrible patient." His heart still raced, the warmth of her lips lingering like a promise, and he knew this moment had changed everything. Lyra straightened, her smile both shy and defiant, as if daring him to cross that line again. "Rest now," she said, her tone mock-stern, though her eyes sparkled with unspoken invitations. "We'll see how you feel tomorrow." As she turned to leave, her fingers brushed his hand one last time, a fleeting touch that carried the weight of all they hadn't said. The door slid shut behind her, leaving Jaxon alone with the soft hum of the Med Bay and the memory of her kiss, a fire that would burn until she returned. The morning after their kiss, the Nexus-7 Med Bay felt like a different world, though nothing had visibly changed. The monitors still hummed, casting their blue glow across the sterile walls, and a faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air. Yet, for Jaxon Reed, every sound, every shadow, seemed to carry the echo of Lyra Voss's lips against his, a memory that burned brighter than the station's artificial sun. He lay against the pillows, his rib nearly healed, but his heart raced with a new kind of ache, one that had nothing to do with his injuries. Lyra entered the room with her usual grace, her silver uniform shimmering under the lights, the glowing patterns on her blue skin pulsing softly. Her emerald eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, a spark of recognition passed between them, warm and unspoken. But she quickly busied herself with her tablet, her movements brisk, almost too professional. "Good morning, Spacer," she said, her voice light but carefully neutral. "Let's check your vitals." Jaxon raised an eyebrow, his grin teasing. "Back to business, Doc? I thought we were past the formalities." His tone was playful, but his gaze lingered, searching for a crack in her composed facade. Lyra's lips twitched, a smile she couldn't quite suppress. "Someone has to keep you in line," she replied, stepping closer to adjust the sensor on his wrist. Her fingers brushed his skin, a touch that should have been routine but sent a quiet thrill through him. She lingered, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and Jaxon caught the faintest hitch in her breath, a sign that the kiss hadn't left her untouched either. Still, she pulled back, her eyes darting away as if to hide the warmth in them. The day unfolded in a delicate dance of pretense, both acting as if the kiss hadn't shifted the ground beneath them. Lyra ran her checks with precision, but her excuses to stay grew flimsier. She'd linger to adjust his pillow, her fingers grazing his shoulder, or sit on the edge of his bed to update his chart, her knee brushing against his. Each touch was a spark, a reminder of the fire they'd ignited, and Jaxon felt the tension coil tighter, a pull neither could ignore. Their conversations resumed, but they carried a new weight. Jaxon teased her about her homeworld's violet skies, asking if she'd ever danced under them. Lyra laughed, her voice softer now, and countered with stories of starlit festivals, her eyes gleaming as she described the music that seemed to pulse like her glowing patterns. "You'd like it," she said, her gaze locking onto his. "You strike me as someone who'd dance with trouble." "Only if it's you," Jaxon replied, his voice low, and the air between them crackled, heavy with unspoken truths. The crew noticed a shift, of course. Marco and Tara swung by during a break, their grins wide and knowing. "You're looking too cozy, Reed," Marco said, nudging Tara. "Doc, you sure he's not faking to stay here?" Lyra didn't miss a beat, her smile sharp. "If he's faking, he's doing a terrible job. Now out, my patient needs peace." She shooed them away, but as the door slid shut, she turned to Jaxon, her eyes softening. "They're not wrong," she murmured, almost to herself. "You are trouble." As the days passed, the pretense began to fray. Lyra's visits stretched longer, her professional demeanor slipping like a mask. She'd sit closer, her laughter freer, her touches bolder, brushing his hand as she passed him a water tablet or resting her palm on his chest to check his breathing, her fingers lingering as if reluctant to leave. Jaxon felt the pull grow stronger, a tide pulling them together, and he knew she felt it too. One evening, as the station's lights dimmed to mimic twilight, Lyra stayed long after her shift should have ended. The Med Bay was quiet, the monitors casting a gentle glow that bathed her in a halo of blue. She sat on the edge of Jackson's bed, her hands folded in her lap, her tablet abandoned on the counter. The silence between them was comfortable but charged, like the calm before a storm. "You're almost fully healed," she said, her voice soft, tinged with something like regret. "Tomorrow, you'll be clear to leave." Jackson's chest tightened, not from pain but from the thought of leaving her. "What if I don't want to go?" he said, his voice raw, unguarded. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, the warmth of her skin grounding him. "Lyra, that kiss wasn't just a moment. Not for me." Her eyes widened, her glowing patterns pulsing brighter, betraying the rush of her emotions. She didn't pull away, her fingers tightening around his. "It wasn't for me either," she whispered, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "I've tried to keep this professional, Jaxon, but you make it impossible." The words hung between them, a confession that broke the last of their defenses. Lyra shifted closer, her thigh pressing against his, and Jaxon felt his breath catch, the world narrowing to just her. "I don't know what this is," she said, her eyes searching his, "but I don't want it to stop." "Then don't," Jaxon said, his voice a quiet plea. He tugged her gently, and she didn't resist, sliding onto the bed beside him. Her body fit against his, warm and steady, her head resting on his shoulder as his arm curled around her. The Med Bay's glow softened, wrapping them in a cocoon of light, and Jaxon felt a peace he hadn't known in years. They lay there, their breaths sinking, the silence filled with all they didn't need to say. Lyra's hand rested on his chest, her fingers tracing idle patterns, each touch a quiet promise. "This is dangerous," she murmured, her voice sleepy but content. "You're dangerous." Jaxon chuckled, pressing a kiss to her forehead, the gesture tender and instinctive. "Good thing you're good at handling danger," he said, his voice low, warm with affection. As the station hummed around them, Lyra's breathing slowed, her body relaxing against his. She drifted into sleep, her glowing patterns dimming to a gentle pulse, and Jaxon held her close, his heart full. The Med Bay, once a place of recovery, had become something more, a sanctuary where two souls had found each other, if only for a night. The Nexus-7 Med Bay had transformed from a place of healing into a haven where Jaxon Reed and Lyra Voss had carved out something precious. Each night, the boundaries between patient and healer blurred further, their shared moments weaving a tapestry of trust and longing. The station's hum was a distant lullaby, and the soft glow of the monitors seemed to pulse in time with their hearts. Tonight, though, the air held a quiet intensity, as if the universe itself knew this moment would define them. Jaxon lay on the narrow bed, his rib now a faint memory, but he had no desire to leave. Lyra's presence had become his anchor, her laughter and fleeting touches grounding him in a way the stars never could. She entered the room as the station's lights dimmed to their deepest twilight, her silver uniform catching the faint glow, her blue skin shimmering with patterns that danced like constellations. Her emerald eyes found his, and the weight of their shared history, the kiss, the confessions, the nights spent tangled in words and warmth, hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. "You're officially cleared," Lyra said, her voice soft, almost reluctant, as she stood at the foot of his bed. She held no tablet, her hands clasped in front of her, fingers twisting slightly as if fighting some inner battle. You can return to the docking bay tomorrow. Jackson's chest tightened, not from pain, but from the thought of stepping back into a world without her by his side. He sat up, his gaze steady, unwavering. I'm not going anywhere, he said, his voice low, resolute. Not unless you're coming with me. Lyra's breath caught, her glowing patterns flaring briefly, betraying the rush of her emotions. She stepped closer, her movements slow, as if drawn by a force stronger than gravity. Jaxon, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and hope. It's not simple. I'm supposed to heal you, not. Not what? He interrupted, reaching for her hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and sure, pulling her gently toward him. Not feel this? Not want this. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, each touch a quiet vow. Lyra, I don't care about simple. I care about you. Her eyes searched his, deep and endless, and for a moment, the Med Bay was silent, the universe holding its breath. Then, with a soft sigh, she surrendered, her hand tightening around his. You make everything complicated, she murmured, but her smile was radiant, a star breaking through the clouds. She sank onto the bed beside him, her body close, her warmth a steady presence that chased away the cold. Jaxon shifted, his arm encircling her, drawing her into the curve of his body. She nestled against him, her head resting on his chest, her glowing patterns casting faint light across the sheets. The Med Bay's monitors dimmed, their blue glow fading as if granting them privacy, and the shadows deepened, wrapping them in a cocoon of quiet intimacy. Their breaths intertwined, a soft rhythm that spoke of trust and belonging. And Jaxon felt her fingers trace idle patterns on his chest, each touch a whisper of connection. In the darkness, they held each other, two shadows merging, finding solace in each other's presence. The lights dimmed further, their silhouettes blending into one, a moment of unity that needed no words. It wasn't about passion alone, but something deeper, a promise, a shared heartbeat, a future they could almost touch. Jackson's hand rested on her back, his touch gentle, grounding, and Lyra's sigh was a melody of contentment, her body relaxing against his. As the night unfolded, time seemed to slip away, the station's hum a distant echo. They spoke in whispers, their voices weaving dreams of what could be, exploring distant worlds, dancing under unfamiliar skies, building a life where they could be more than healer and spacer. Each word was a thread, binding them closer, and Jaxon felt a certainty settle in his bones. This was where he belonged. When the station's lights began to brighten, mimicking dawn, Jaxon stirred, his arms still around Lyra. Her eyes fluttered open, her glowing patterns soft but steady, and she looked up at him, her smile sleepy but sure. Morning, she murmured, her voice warm with affection. Morning, Jaxon replied, his thumb brushing her cheek, tracing the edge of her glowing patterns. You're still here. Always, she said, her eyes sparkling with a promise that needed no explanation. She shifted, pressing a soft kiss to his jaw, a gesture so tender it made his heart ache. They lay there for a moment longer, wrapped in the quiet glow of the Med Bay, the world beyond the door unimportant. As they rose, hand in hand, Jaxon knew this was only the beginning. The docking bay could wait, the stars could wait. None of it mattered as much as the woman beside him. They stepped out of the Med Bay together, their fingers intertwined, a new hope lighting their path. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side, their hearts bound by a love that had sparked in the unlikeliest of places and grown into something unbreakable.